Hello, my name is Andrew Browning. I'm a partner at HBW Resources. Hello. We are an energy environment consulting firm with operations in Denver, Washington, D.C., and Houston, and work on a number of CCS issues for clients around the country. I am happy to have such a great panel, I think, that kind of represents a spectrum of CCS policy, regulation, development. I think we're going to have an exciting conversation about something that's new, but quickly catalyzing to an important environmental tool to address climate change, but also a great business opportunity for a number of companies across the country, as we are kind of pulling the parts of economic viability, technology, and legal and regulatory regimes to make it all successful. So I'm going to introduce our guests, and I'm going to ask them not quickly, we're going to spend a little bit of time here to talk a little bit about themselves, their background, but also CCS, the role their organization plays, its vision, its economic and business model, and also their view on kind of where CCS fits in the overall kind of societal push towards addressing climate issues. And I'm going to start with Matt Fry with Great Plains Institute.
Thanks, Andrew. Glad to be here. Can you hear me? There we go. So I'm Matt Fry, as you mentioned. I'm a senior policy manager at the Great Plains Institute. We work kind of with states and regions across the country to help develop policies and regulations and statutes to help support carbon management projects. Andrew asked me to do the 3-minute elevator speech on what CCUS actually is, so I'll do that quickly. The first C is carbon. When we talk about it, we're specifically talking about carbon dioxide. There's some incentives that we'll talk about later that promote the capture of carbon dioxide, and to an extent we also talk about carbon monoxide, but basically we're talking about carbon dioxide when we're the first C in CCUS. Capture is where you capture that CO2 when it's emitted from a source. When you burn a fossil, your impacts or your emissions are CO2 and water, basically. So you intend to capture that CO2 before it enters the environment, because that CO2 causes a climate impact. The next letter, the U, is utilization. So you can use that CO2 once it's captured for any number of things. You can use it as a working fuel for enhanced oil recovery. Oxy's done that for decades, 5 decades it's been done. You can also use that CO2 as a feedstock for chemistry fuels, like low carbon intensity fuels. You can use it to make better cement. You can use it for any number of things, and those technologies are expanding. And then finally, the storage. So storage, when we capture that CO2, you typically compress it, put it into a pipeline, or on site you use it or inject it for storage. The storage comes into play when you do enhanced oil recovery. You incidentally store that CO2 subsurface in the geology associated with your production of oil, gas, and then the other option is that you inject it deep subsurface into geologic saline formations, typically greater than 800 meters, just because pressure issues, in supercritical state where it's stored permanently. And the intent there with the EPA and all of the regulations and requirements is that CO2 is stored permanently in the subsurface. Hopefully that was quick enough.
I think so.
Okay.
We're right on schedule. Julie.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And Kirby, of course, thanks to you and Garfield County. So I'm the director of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. And in late 2020, an engineering consulting firm approached us to say, what are you guys doing about carbon sequestration? And I was like, I'm sorry, what are those words, please? And in essence, somebody proposed to us that carbon sequestration is an important tool to have in the toolkit for hard to decarbonize sectors in particular. And right now in Colorado, carbon sequestration is regulated by the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. And the consultant said, should Colorado have a seat at the table? Should we be able to provide our own regulatory structure that meets the needs of Colorado, not necessarily the needs as established by the federal government? And I said, well, that's a great idea. We should look at it. So we've been trying to run legislation that would allow the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission to pursue primacy from EPA to be able to be the regulator for Class 6 or carbon sequestration injection wells. We're still working on that initiative. I still think it is an important undertaking. As a result of jumping in on that early to try to, explore it, we've also, COGCC has done 2 different studies on carbon sequestration and participated in the Colorado's CCUS task force. And so we've done a deep dive on the regulatory requirements. To me, I think it's a really interesting opportunity for our organization. Much of the technology, much of the geology, much of the work is what I think of as oil and gas adjacent. Similar skills, similar understanding when you think about drilling, when you think about understanding of geology, when you think about the things that we're doing, understanding emissions from rigs, impacts to community, protection of groundwater. Those are all things that we're doing right now. And so I think we're very well poised with our expertise to use that in a different space. So I think it's a great way for Colorado to put its mark on this space, to say this is how we expect companies to sequester carbon in Colorado, and we're continuing to work on it. And there are a number of related topics that we'll hopefully get into later today and try to keep on time.
Chad?
Thanks, Andrew. I'm Chad Calvert. I work for Chevron. I want to thank Kirby and Garfield County as well, and Colorado Mesa University for hosting this. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you. So I guess I'm here because Chevron's got projects around the world for permanent sequestration. In fact, the CCS it's not a dream. It's a technology that's being executed in certain places around the world, and we have a very large permanent sequestration project in Australia that's currently doing, I think I wrote it down here, about 4 million tons a year of permanent sequestration. But it is a technology that is still emerging. It's something we learn from as we build it. I am concerned that Colorado's falling behind in the chase for the investment dollars. I think other states have gotten ahead of Colorado because there are certain fundamental things that need to be addressed to invite that investment into a state, and those things in Colorado are still unsolved. One of those is who owns the pore space you put the carbon into. Is it the surface owner or is it the mineral owner? And until you know that for sure, you would hesitate to put it into some place where you might be in trespass, right? If you don't have a lease with the right person or the right party. Another issue that must be addressed is how do you unitize those owners? Because if you put CCS, you can't just put it in a 20-acre tract. You need more space than that. And so how do you bring together owners to create units? That's another issue that has not been addressed in Colorado law. And a third issue, I think, that Director Murphy, and thank you for your leadership on these, on the studies that COGCC has done, because they are very impressive and very thorough. And I would strongly encourage you to read the one that they issued in January, because I think it's one of the best done studies on the policy topics around CCS that I've seen. But the third issue is who gets to permit, and I think you just highlighted that. Right now you have to go to the EPA for a well permit, and it's a very timely, or it takes a lot of time. And I think that COGCC has better experience with permitting than probably any agency in the country when it comes to wells. So it's the right place to do this, and I thank you again for proposing, again, in another legislative session, since they don't seem to be interested in actually passing something, for proposing it again to get that delegation for the agency. And then a fourth issue that is something we should address. It's not a critical fundamental thing, but it's liability. How do you deal with potential long-term storage liability? So those are four things I think that are fundamentals, and that, we'll get to some other issues here shortly.
Kyle?
Thank you. Am I live? How about now? No? How about, okay.
There you go.
I figured that would happen as soon as I raised my voice. Hi, I'm Kyle Quackenbush. I'm the segment president for liquids at Tallgrass. I actually oversee our legacy crude oil assets. We're a midstream energy company, as well as all of our CO2 related efforts. That's a blessing in Colorado. It means I can go to all the dinner parties and have something to talk about. I'll just play up one of the sides of my role, depending on who I'm hanging out with, because that's kind of where we are today. Tallgrass is, again, a midstream company in the Rockies. We are leaning heavily into the areas that we can participate in energy transition, and a lot of that has CCUS related. So we are developing multiple projects in multiple states, actually, in and around Colorado, and so really relevant to what we're talking about here today, because we have a couple projects that are out there publicly, one of which is our Trailblazer pipeline project, a conversion of a natural gas pipeline to be able to move CO2 for regional sequestration that can serve emission sources in Colorado, Nebraska, Wyoming, and can serve sequestration sites in Colorado, Nebraska, and Wyoming. And so it's a really great project to look at policy because we touch all these different states. Each are approaching CCUS in a different way. Each are approaching carbon emissions in a different way. And so that's been a really good project to view as a lens to view the opportunities in each of those different areas for improvements. And particularly in the case of Colorado, if you look at each of those 3 states and how advanced they have become in their policy positions, in also local support for CCUS, how Colorado contrasts in those areas. So we have, I know that's been a theme here, will be a theme here a lot today. At Tallgrass, for us, it's always been a question of all of the above and as we try to approach decarbonization. And so our firm is one that looks at specifically extending our business lines. And so we're looking at things along the lines of decarbonized hydrogen production and infrastructure, CCUS to support a lot of our legacy customers that have either that are utilizing natural gas today or otherwise need to find a way to deal with their emissions or want to do what's right and as fast as possible. And so CCUS has a really important role to play. It's one thing that I think we'll touch on a lot here is as far as like the near-term possibility for massive decarbonization. There really isn't anything out there as potent as CCUS. And now we have incentives in place. If policy can catch up, we could be talking about an emissions profile in Colorado that's a fraction of what it is today if we would really get on and move on these things. So it's an exciting time on that front. So thank you all again for being here. This is an awesome venue. This is my first time being here. And thank you, Kirby, for putting on a great event. Look forward to the conversation.
Thanks so much. First question I pitch out there is to Matt, and it's the role of the language of CCUS in the Inflation Reduction Act as a part of the Biden administration's climate plan. Give us an overview on this piece of legislation, how it's changed the economics, the dynamics, and the viability of the industry.
Sure. So carbon management itself is expensive, right? Capturing CO2 is not a cheap endeavor. You can go anywhere from like $8 to $120 a ton to capture CO2. And none of you are in business to not make money. So there's a bridge, there's a challenge to carbon management that needs to be addressed. And typically the way we've done that over time is through legislation and policy. We did it to put the wind industry on its feet. Now it's a profitable market. Solar industry is a little behind just because there's some different challenges associated with it. But I think the reality is if we're going to meet climate objectives, whether you believe in them or not, there is a need to capture and store CO2 at like the tune of 6 billion tons per year to meet climate objectives. So this administration and even the previous administration worked on legislation to help support and incentivize the carbon management industry. The first one, I'll start with the first one, which was the bipartisan infrastructure law that happened prior to the IRA. It allocated roughly $20 billion of incentives to companies to help manage carbon emissions through a number of different programs. Those dollars are typically implemented through the Department of Energy, through grant funding. There's been a rolling series of funding announcements that have come out for folks to apply for those funds to help support and bridge the economics on those projects. Additionally, there was about $8 billion for low carbon intensity hydrogen production that's been made available through the IRA, which we'll talk about now. So the low carbon intensity hydrogen, I could talk about that for about an hour, and we've only got 25 minutes left, so I won't go too deep into that. But the IRA provided 45V, a tax incentive for low carbon intensity hydrogen that gives you like upwards of $60 per kilogram or 60 cents per kilogram for hydrogen production. But in specifics to the carbon management discussion that we're having today, what the IRA or the Inflation Reduction Act did was to increase and kind of improve what was known as the 45Q tax incentive. 45Q, just in simplistic terms, provides an incentive to companies that capture and permanently store carbon dioxide. So the key here is you have to permanently store it to have the 45Q tax incentive available to you. And there's tiers associated depending on what your technologies are. So you get roughly anywhere between $60 per ton for enhanced recovery to up to $180 per ton for direct air capture technology. So the administration, they have very aggressive policy and I guess regulatory goals associated with carbon management, but these laws that are in place now have been done bipartisan, fully bipartisan in nature. None of them would have been implemented without support from both sides of the aisle, and I think the reality is that Congress understands that we need to capture and store CO2, but we also need affordable, reliable energy. So to do that, we're going to rely on oil, gas, and our traditional fossils for until I'm dead. So it's going to be a necessity that we continue to produce and utilize these in a low carbon intensity manner.
Thank you. Hello, hello. You hear me? Hello? Okay. A little bit of a lag here. So you can see my dilemma. We have a whole lot to talk about in just a little bit of time. But so I'm going to try to fold in a couple of questions. I want to go from Julie to Chad to Kyle to talk about, expound a little bit more on primacy and what Colorado is pursuing. What is Colorado's end goal with CCS, and where does it see its role? Chad, you and I had a discussion prior to this on your experience, Chevron's work in other states, and I wanted you to expound a little bit more on your thoughts on optionality, what other states are doing, what you think is needed to meet climate goals for your company and just societal climate goals. And then Kyle, you are operating in a number of other states with different approaches, different ways on incentivizing CCS, and maybe you could expound a little bit. Particularly, I'm most familiar with Wyoming, and let's dive into what they're doing as well. So first, Julie.
Thank you. And as I said, in my experience with Colorado and Gas Conservation Commission, the journey of carbon sequestration started in 2020 or so, and over the course of that time, in partnering with my colleagues at the Colorado Energy Office and Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment on a number of these issues, there have been other concurrent conversations in Colorado, specifically cumulative impacts, environmental justice, water quality and water quality protection, and those pieces all need to be fit in and be addressed. And again, in Colorado right now, there is a regulatory body and a regulatory regime in place to oversee and to permit carbon sequestration wells. For me, the opportunity is to make sure that Colorado's expectations, as it relates to some of the topics that I've just identified, and in particular environmental justice, are carried forward into a permitting and regulatory regime that's representative of what Colorado wants based on what the actions that the legislature has taken in the last few years. I think it's a huge opportunity. It's also an opportunity for our organization to work with where the market is driving things, where federal policy is driving things, and be at the forefront, well, almost at the forefront per Chad's comments, of emerging technologies. And I've spent the last 5 or 8 years of my career at COGCC answering questions like, what's your plan for the energy transition? What is COGCC's role? How do we do this? And for me, looking at these different emerging technologies and making sure that we are adapting to them and providing a similar regulatory environment that carries forward Colorado's expectations, I've said that a lot this morning, is really critical when it comes to the primacy application, right? That is something that EPA has very focused expectations on. We will need to meet or exceed EPA's regulatory floor. We've spent 3 years looking at those regulations. We have a close working relationship with EPA because COGCC is already a delegate, has primacy for Class 2 wells for E&P waste wells. So we understand the downhole pieces, we understand the regulatory process, and we have relationships with EPA to help make that a possibility. So primacy, to me, it's a long process. If we are authorized to pursue it, it's a year or so of us looking at our regulatory environment and building the right regulatory environment, and then working with EPA to sign off on it. It is not easy, it is not quick, and that's why I've been pushing so hard to move forward on it before we actually have a project proposed. Unfortunately, we've missed that a little bit. We have a couple of projects proposed right now that are seeking permitting through EPA in Colorado. So that there are a number of these themes, a number of these issues. How that fits into a broader picture, right? It uses expertise that our organization already has, number one, which is great. And number two, it fits into the overarching goals of the state as it relates to the greenhouse gas roadmap. Again, how do we decarbonize? How do we meet these lofty goals? This is a tool. It also doesn't mean that it's necessarily going forward everywhere, right? And one of the key questions I think we all need to wrestle with, and this to me is an important thing when local governments are looking at, do I invest my local government resources in understanding CCS, in understanding underground injection? I think the first question needs to be, is the geology that would support a sequestration well in my jurisdiction? And if it's not, you can probably deploy your resources elsewhere, right? If it is, then maybe you should have a different conversation about what it means for your community. And that's part of what we need to evaluate, I think, as Colorado as we move forward. And I mean, I could go for days, but I'm not going to. So with that, I'd hand it off to Chad.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
Answer your earlier question then?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll shift gears a little bit. I think one of Chevron's guiding principles on carbon management really is cost effectiveness, right? Identifying the lowest marginal abatement cost for a ton of carbon, wherever it is, and doing those first. So achieving the ones that are going to cost $10 a ton first before we go to the $150 a ton abatement. And that just makes sense, right? But your system has to enable that. And what we have in Colorado is a big challenge in front of us. We have together, as a society here, chosen to achieve significant reductions from a baseline. And our baseline is roughly 130 million tons a year of carbon emissions here, and we are intending to get that down by 2030, just 7 years away, to 70. So how are we going to cut 60 million tons out of our inventory? We need optionality, and we need to be laser focused on those lowest cost abatements first, because otherwise we're going to inadvertently wreck certain parts of our economy. If you suddenly challenge the ag sector, for example, to come up with a bunch of $50 a ton projects when they can be achieved for $10 in a different sector, that's going to be crippling for investment in the ag sector. And every sector has that story, right? How do you decarbonize the transportation sector in a cost-effective way? So the policy really needs to enable that cross-sector investment so that you can, if you have $100 ton abatement costs in the oil and gas sector, but I can invest in a nature-based solution with the ag sector or a transportation solution for $30, it just makes sense. Colorado does not have that today. We are very locked into our silos. So the transportation sector has their targets, the oil and gas sector has our targets. We have a capped system. The industrial sector is capped, the oil and gas sector is capped, and the utility sector is capped. We just don't have a trade system. So I can't believe I'm saying this. 10 years ago, I would have said cap and trade, this is a crazy idea. And now I'm looking at California and saying Colorado needs to be more like California, because California has a trade system. You can buy a ton of credits for $30 a ton on the market, and that has enabled investment in CCS. So Chevron has 3 pilot projects in CCS in California. One of them is a post-fuel combustion project for sequestration. One of them is a biomass plant sequestration project, and one of them is a cogen facility for our steam flooding. And so all of these are carbon sequestration projects that are being enabled by policy, right? They're being enabled by the cap and trade system in California. So that's sort of my advocacy point. I think Colorado needs to move in that direction. We need that flexibility to have that optionality to achieve these really significant challenges we've set for ourselves.
Thank you. Well, great points and a good contrast too, as Andrew mentioned, like our neighbors are really leaning into these opportunities. And it's something that I think is really instructive for Colorado to look at. One, from a policy perspective, like, hey, what's out there and what is working and getting investment. The other one is, what opportunities am I going to miss out on as a state by not really aggressively approaching this? So Andrew mentioned, so we are working in Wyoming is our primary sequestration location, because Wyoming is one of the states that has primacy. It's one of the 2 that has primacy. So that allows us to work with the state on a known, expedited, and streamlined process to be able to get permits. You know, folks were talking here about, 18-month process, even, for drilling activity. For the EPA Class 6 permit, that's one of the challenges. You have very few data points of those permits actually being granted. They were years and years long processes. Now in North Dakota, you have a permit that was issued in less than a year, and Wyoming's target is about a year to be able to issue a permit, a time horizon that you can really plan around and invest around. So that means that's where you'll go for those sequestration opportunities. What does that mean? That means that the industries that are in those areas have the ability to decarbonize more quickly. It means that the people who are in those communities, because we're going to areas to be able to lease pore space, we're going to landowners and saying, hey, I would like to compensate you in this rural part of the country for a right that you own as a surface owner that has no other value to you otherwise. We can pour millions of dollars of money into these rural communities in investment for this pore space opportunity. Then we're creating these local jobs. So there's a hyper-specific benefit to this area that otherwise isn't available. And obviously, as we think about opportunities in Colorado, and you just think beyond just the metropolitan areas, there are a number of folks that could benefit from this type of investment in their region. The last thing is actually the incremental business opportunity. So in Colorado we talk about, and Chad does a great job of highlighting this fact, one of two things is going to happen in Colorado. If we're going to hit these targets that are laid out for us, we're going to end up with solutions that are going to have massive economic impact because you didn't put the policies in place to be able to more cost effectively deal with your emissions in CCUS. So that means you're either scaling back the industry or you're forcing them to have solutions that make no economic sense, which is only going to have an increase in cost for all of us who are living here, or push those industries out entirely. They don't go away, they just go somewhere else. I think that's one of the really important notes for these states as they think about these opportunities is you might remove an emission source from your area. You're probably just moving a job out of your area, and it's going to somewhere else because that product is still needed. And Wyoming and Nebraska are asking for those as an opportunity. Again, you're not replacing the need, you're just having it move somewhere else. Nebraska is another good example, though, of a state that doesn't have primacy but is leaning way into this as far as all the policies that they have laid out to say, okay, what does someone need to be able to get regulatory certainty that's within the state's control to get projects done and to get investment there? And so that's, Chad had highlighted it as far as everything from utilization to who owns the right to store the CO2. Again, pore space is not a term we use a whole lot here in the oil and gas side of things, but basically we are procuring the right to store the CO2 underground. So we are going to the landowners and compensating them for doing that so that when we put that CO2 underground, we know where it is going to be and we're paying for that right and compensating people for that. That needs to be well established. In addition to the policy, though, there needs to be a narrative that we want these things to happen in our state. Even in places that have good policy, it's not a unified voice like it needs to be about the benefits of CCUS for industry, for jobs, for landowners, and again, to accomplish the goal that I think is now unanimous, that we're all trying to accomplish to lower our carbon emissions as a state, as a country, as a people, right? And so there is still some confusing data out there for people that makes it seem like we're not going to accomplish that deep decarbonization through CCUS, and that's just patently false. And so I think Colorado is really sitting at an interesting time right now. It has areas that it can contrast. Its neighbors are courting these industries. Our neighbors are putting the policies in place to get these things done. Our neighbors are going to get all of those investment dollars, and their industries will thrive. Here we will be, and we will be trying to achieve really, really important goals. But we will do it with one hand tied behind our back, and we will end up with outcomes that may or may not achieve those goals, or in order to achieve them, we did it like in the most expensive ways possible, or we achieved our goals by moving industries to other areas. So we can claim that we have fewer emissions in the state, but it wasn't because we reduced emissions from power generation like we could have here in the state. It's because those moved on. So again, I think that it's very important to think in such a silo in the state, to broaden our horizon, even just regionally, to realize what this opportunity is. And there's a lot of lessons that can be learned. There's a lot of things that can be rolled out. One piece here, though, for this particular group, I think that is important. At least it's been my experience. When I started working on these projects, and probably has been true for many of you as well, like for those of us in the energy space, like, holy cow, I get to work on something that everyone is going to cheer for, you know, like finally, like, hey, no, I want to put this pipeline in here that's going to save the world, you're welcome. It hasn't gone quite like that, you know. Humans are amazing, it's always interesting, right? So we need to really be thoughtful about how to get this industry established well. And that means a broader collective of folks than we're engaging today. Everyone in this room, I think, sees the opportunity set. Are we doing a good job of building a massive stakeholder base from all the other industries that exist, from landowner groups who exist in the state? Like broadening this chorus of voices, because it really, it's been our experience specifically in Nebraska, that like 95% of the people are cheering for this to get done. Once you help them understand what's going on, there's a fear component to something that's new, even though it's not novel, but it is new for these areas. But for us to be successful in the state, we keep talking about the policy side, that stakeholder engagement chorus of voices needs to be much broader than this group, including building new alliances that historically maybe we haven't worked with, to be able to get this established well, and to make it just abundantly clear that this is necessary and efficient and works on so many levels, and it can be done quickly, safely, and effectively. And so again, leaning into this in a way that we shouldn't just assume that it's going to happen, assume that people will support this, assume that it's going to get done just because it makes sense, which it does. It takes a whole other level of engagement, and if we do that now well, I think we can get this thing launched in the state, and then we will look back and be excited for what we did.
Thanks. You obviously moved into my next topic of conversation, and that is, you know, we do have a lot of local county commissioners, folks that are active at the, you know, with their neighbors at the community level on oil and gas issues. I guess I'll ask Matt. You know, I know you have worked in some other areas. You know, other states, other regions are looking at this. Louisiana has a robust CCS industry. There is a burgeoning efforts in the Midwest as well. What have you seen that has worked at the community level that maybe could be emulated by Colorado communities that are interested in attracting CCS industry?
Yeah, so I think beyond the policy that we've talked about, and I'll say this, I'm biased. I live in the neighboring state. I've been in Wyoming for 20 years. I've worked on policy and projects in this nature in Wyoming for 15, but I think what counties may look at doing is pre-planning to expect for the future in these projects. I developed a project in Wyoming where we received federal authorization for a couple thousand miles of pipeline corridor just to facilitate the build out of pipelines and support CO2 or CCUS in the state. I'm not saying you need to follow that model, but I think it's a good idea to think now so that you have a really good idea of where these infrastructure may be best placed, so that your future plan out and your future engagements may be a little bit easier. So when I developed that project, I went to every county where we had proposed a line and talked to those county commissioners and figured out what the potential roadblocks or challenges would be and tried to address that before we put any lines on a map or anything. So the clock's ticking. I won't get too in depth, but I think pre-planning and making some assumptions of where your infrastructure may be in the future is a really good idea.
Excellent. Yeah, we are in the red zone now.
We are in the red zone.
So with that, I'll ask the audience for questions in our remaining 6 minutes.
Tom Janikowski, Garfield County Commissioner. My question is, where are the dollars coming from for this industry? And are they driven by policy? And if they are driven by policy, is the policy punitive to the industry?
That we're talking about, at least in my discussion, are federal dollars implemented and allocated by Congress. Those are incentives, but the actual investment dollars are coming from these folks, right? Like the federal dollars are a bridge and attaboy sort of thing, but the real investment dollars come from industry.
I would add one thing. Carbon pricing can be achieved in a number of ways. One is to have a cap system where eventually you're going to have to pay to abate, right? And then suddenly carbon becomes worth something, especially if you have a credit system where I can monetize that sequestration. So if I go out and CCS is not the answer for everything, right? It's an answer for some things. It will help the utility sector. It will certainly enable hydrogen development because blue hydrogen depends on CCS. So for the transportation fleets that you might want to put on hydrogen, you're going to need a CCS plan. These things can create value in and of themselves. It doesn't have to depend on federal tax dollars, although the credits certainly, I think, are incentivizing a lot of interest in it right now from investors.
I was going to say, we've taken the carrot approach so far, and the stick isn't here on what will happen in the future. You can look at Canada as an example of one that has it. It is more of a carbon tax, and so you have to find a way to achieve your goals. And so I think we'll see how this develops, but today it's just the incentives to get these investments up and going.
Yes, sir.
So back in 2019, I think it was University of Chicago had an excellent study where they looked at 29 states that implemented RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standards, and they saw that it cost them between $130 to $430 a ton to mitigate CO2 using wind and solar. So if you look at that study, was that a waste of money to do RPSs throughout all those states? And if you can get your cost down to $100 a ton, why aren't we just doing CCS?
I'm kind of passionate about some of the stuff. I think in the RPS scenario, you've chosen a technology and you've forced it on people instead of choosing a performance standard, which is lower carbon, and letting innovation solve the problem. And so you ended up with market distortions where you were paying way too much for the abatement, right? You were substituting at a power source for what you had, but the cost could have been achieved. You could have done it for a lot less money if you had just. I work for a company filled with engineers, and that's what engineers love to do. They like to overcome challenges, and so you give them the challenge, and they will identify the lowest cost, most efficient ways to do it. With an RPS, it was just an artificial standard. That's one man's opinion.
Over here.
So after here, can one of you guys speak for all of them?
Yeah, I can start. So we're actually not getting the cart before the horse. We've been implementing these technologies for over 5 decades. It's just historically it's done for enhanced oil and gas recovery. We've done a number of analyses and models that show what the potential for Colorado is, and I'm going to give the GPI plug. Go to our website. You can find those analyses. You can see the models. You can see the maps. There's a lot of potential in Colorado. There's tremendous potential in Colorado geologically. You need to figure out what you do with your linear infrastructure, but as far as the opportunities, it's abundant here, and I will pass it on to the experts from there.
Thanks. If I can take 30 to 45 seconds so I don't take all the time, but I agree with Matt. There's enormous potential, and what's been most interesting to me on COGCC's path to evaluating carbon sequestration and underground injection control wells in particular, we started touching in all of these different spaces. We have helium projects coming to COGCC right now. We started looking at deep geothermal. I know Brian talked about it a little bit earlier. We're looking at what does hydrogen mean. Colorado's looking at participating in a hydrogen hub. And then complementary to all this, we're talking about natural gas storage. And so the report that we put together last year that was supposed to be about what are the regulatory needs to have a carbon sequestration program in Colorado ended up with this little appendix called emerging energy industries. And it's really focused on this conversation. How can Colorado play? What role can we play? How can we go? We're trying to pursue changes right now that would allow COGCC to be looking at carbon sequestration, to be looking at geothermal, to be looking at gas storage, because we do need a statewide approach, in my opinion, right? Not in COGCC's opinion, in Julie's opinion. And complementary to that, there are 2 studies that we think are entirely appropriate. One is to look at hydrogen, and we hear the conversation. Should we be looking at blue hydrogen or green hydrogen, or both, or none? That is one of the pieces, but hydrogen is a different element. It behaves differently than so many of the other constituents that we're used to regulating, so it needs a deeper look, right? And how does that fit in with our neighbors' plans, to your points, Kyle? And then the last piece, I'm sorry, I totally blew 30 seconds.
You have a prerogative, go ahead.
Thanks. The last piece of it is looking at the linear infrastructure, Matt, the pipelines. How are we gonna do this? What are we gonna do about this? But to me, the opportunity to have a statewide look at all these pieces, to pull together the work from USGS, from CGS, from Great Plains, it's ripe. It's an amazing opportunity, and we're just on the edge of it, and I'm on the edge of my seat about it, so.
Thanks so much. Spoken from 2 members of the White House CCS Task Force as well, so I want to recognize Matt and Julie for that honor as well. Thanks so much, Kirby. We've had the red screen on for about 30 seconds here, so I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you so much for a great panel, guys.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.